Okay, now we go to middle childhood, the concrete operational stage. So, what's going on with little kids at this age? So, now, because of those biological changes with the myelination, the increased attention, the reaction time, all that stuff, because all of that's improved, kids really take off in school. So they're really intrinsically motivated at school too. They really have this desire to learn everything that they possibly can around the world around them. They're great learners. Now, unlike the earlier pre-operational stage, now they can think in a way that's very much like what we ask them to do in school academically. So they're able to deal with strategies for solving problems. So if you give them a math problem, they can actually use different methods to find the answer to that math problem. The math is still relatively unabstract. In other words, they're not going to be doing algebra anytime soon, not till they're like 12 or so. They can't move numbers around quite that well, but they are able to follow operations, right? Basic operations, ergo concrete operational stage. They're able to think rationally and logically. Those obstacles that we talked about in the pre-operational stage, like centration, egocentrism, focus on appearance, and most especially conservation, those things they're able to get past that. So now they understand the logic more about the world around them. It's not quite as magical. Okay. So like I said, concrete reasons logically about direct experiences and perceptions. So that conservation, they now have it. They understand, like that little girl up there with the two glasses. She understands that it doesn't matter what the shape of the container is, the liquid remains the same. She understands reversibility, right? Just because you do something doesn't mean it can't be taken back. So like, if ice cream falls on your pants and you wash it well, then once the pants dry, they're perfectly fine. Little kids don't see that, right? Another thing is something called seriation. Seriation is basically let's say you have like 100 beads all in a row, okay? Um, you have this little kid and you say to this, let's say around 5-year-old, okay? You say to the 5-year-old, count to 100. The child can do that without a problem, okay? And then you bring this little child in front of this row of beads and you say to the little child, okay, I want you to show me out of this row, with this first one being 1 and this last one being 100, where you think the 25th bead would be about. Like, you don't have to count it, just estimate where you think it is. Little kids that are pre-operational can't do that. Kids that are concrete operational can, because they start to see the whole and they understand the parts that make up the whole. Little pre-operational kids cannot. Classification also begins. So what do I mean by that? I mean by, like, you know, you have animals, and then you have like mammals, and then you have like dogs, and then you have a species of dogs, and how things break down. You have this really large idea, and it breaks down via classification into smaller and smaller parts. Little children who are pre-operational can't think along those lines. Concrete operational can. And you can see that all of these have a lot of similarities when we talk about operational, right? Logical progression kind of things. But once you start getting too abstract, they can't. Okay, so concrete operational still is not really dealing with abstractions. Lastly, spatial reasoning kicks in, so cognitive maps. Little children, I would say I want to say around 3rd grade, so around 7 and 8 years old, little children start to deal with geography in school. They don't deal with it before that because they have a lot of trouble with it. I mean, they can do some really basic stuff, but they can't like really understand spatial maps and cognitive maps and stuff. And so now at this age, they begin to be able to understand it. So like I said, Piaget's term for the ability to reason logically about direct experiences and perceptions. They're dealing with classification, logical principle that things can be organized into groups, reversibility, the logical principle that a thing that has been changed can be returned to its original state, and identity, the logical principle that certain characteristics of an object remain the same even if other characteristics change. Okay. Um, it's important to note that though almost all children all over the world have these obstacles to operational thought during their pre-operational stage, so like conservation, all that stuff, there are differences cross-culturally. So conservation tends to be delayed, or it doesn't arise as quickly in more tribal cultures. Um, Going to school gives experience on Piaget task. And that makes sense, right? So if you're going to school, then you're probably going to learn a lot of these logical operations earlier than if you weren't. But remember, there are other ways that you can learn these things too. Like in the bottom, there's that picture of the children with the candy, and they're selling the goods on the street and stuff. They're probably much better or are able to do operational tasks with money and stuff and math earlier than, let's say, a child over here. So it just depends on the culture and what particular task you're testing the child on. It's all about what they're exposed to as they're growing up. So limitations. Like I said, kids are not terribly abstract, all right? You can't take them too far beyond a simple linear operational task. All right. And so that's Piaget at this stage. Then we've got Vygotsky. So Vygotsky sort of talks about how children develop cognitively by learning from the people around them. So peers, teachers, friends, just older people in general. Kids can learn from all these sources. And as long as the task that you're instructing them in is within their zone of proximal development, they can do it. So what do I mean by that? So the zone of proximal development is basically something that they can't necessarily do yet, but they're getting close. So we see here a picture of a girl. It looks like they're drawing some kind of circle or something. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a boy. Excuse me. And it looks like the two boys, like one boy is showing the other boy how to draw something. So if this little boy wasn't able to hold a pencil correctly and wasn't able to do like some basic, I guess, writing or drawing of some sort, then he probably would not be able to learn whatever it is this boy is trying to teach him. So you need like the basics that are like a scaffold for the kid, so that when you take them that one step higher, they can do it, right? If you're trying to teach a child how to garden, for instance, if the child can't hold a shovel and the child can't dig a hole, and the child can't like gently move a plant, then chances are they're not going to be really successful. But if you have a kid who has the motor skills to hold the shovel, to be able to dig into the ground, and you'd be surprised. I remember when Griffin and Sarah were like 2, they really couldn't dig a hole into the ground. It was just too hard for them. They couldn't hold the shovel right. And like I said, the ground was just too hard. But as soon as they were able to do that, then I could teach them how to plant a garden, because now the garden was in their zone of proximal development. They had the basics that set them up for success. And culture is really going to dictate that, right? So if you're exposed to and learn the foundation for certain things in your culture, chances are you'll be successful. And what's important in each culture is really different. So planting and farming may be really, really important in one culture, whereas in another culture, it's handling money. Okay, so let's say you can even look at it within the United States. Somebody who grows up in Wisconsin on a farm is probably going to learn the motor skills and stuff, and the logic, and understanding how to care for like plants and how to plant them. And they're going to learn that skill set really, really early, because that's what their parents do. It's all around them, other people in their community. So they're going to have a really strong scaffold for that. And chances are, via a mentor, they're going to learn how to do that earlier than a child, let's say, that grows up in the inner city. Maybe that kid, won't understand the components necessary for planting and farming and stuff. But that child will understand how to count money earlier, right? Because everything you have to buy. So it'll understand, I need X amount of change so I can go downstairs out of my apartment building to the corner deli and get what I want, or get what my mom needs, or whatever. So the environment's going to dictate. Children who are born, so I spent some time down in the Amazon jungle, and I noticed something with the children down there, that their spatial maps, understanding how to get from point A to point B, and trust me, I could not have navigated that place at all. It all looked the same to me. But those children learn really, really early how to deal with their environment, so that they were actually taking me places because I didn't know where the heck I was. But they learn really, really early about spatial maps. And I would argue that it's most likely that areas of the brain responsible for spatial maps, like the hippocampus and stuff, are more developed in those kids at an earlier stage, and that their knowledge and an ability to navigate is going to be developed much earlier in that culture than, let's say, somebody being raised, I don't know, here in the United States. So you see how it works, the relationship between the culture, the mentor, and what a child learns early on. So task child cannot do alone with a zone of proximal development. Like I said, it's a task a child can't do alone, but can learn with help. They've got to be just about there. Okay. They don't know how to do it, but they're just getting up there. Okay. So it's social interaction, which promotes cognitive development. All right. Um, Piaget calls children's private speech egocentric speech. That's basically talking to yourself. I don't know about you guys, but I talk to myself all the time, which is kind of scary when you read the slide, but I do. And why do we do it? We use it as a way to control ourselves and plan. It's a way to guide ourselves to get something done. Okay. And here it says, PJ calls it egocentric speech. Vygotsky views it as a foundation for all higher cognitive processes. Because if you think about it, if you watch a little kid talk to themselves when they're doing something, they're talking themselves through the problem. They're problem solving out loud, and it's helping them progress through the operation. So it helps guide behavior. It helps to think about mental activities. Most of the time, and I think this is true for all of us, we talk to ourselves when it's a really difficult problem. So if I've been given a really, really difficult math problem, chances are I'm going to verbalize and I'm going to try and talk my way through it. It keeps me calm, and it helps me think about the pieces that I need to get past to solve the problem. Um, and it's argued that as the children get older, this egocentric speech, if you will, becomes internalized, and it becomes something that we call internal speech. And I think we all know what that is, because I would say that we're probably talking to ourselves 24/7. And in fact, if anybody has taken a meditation course, in meditation, basically what they're trying to do is turn off your internal speech, because we talk to ourselves so consistently all the time about everything. Even when we're just like driving in the car, we're talking to ourselves about something. So can you imagine how difficult it would be to turn that off over time? Well, that's what they kind of train you to do in meditation. But early on, it's a real tool for cognitive development in kids. Make believe play, again, really important. It kind of it's rich in private speech, right? It helps bring one's actions under the control of thoughts so that you're not just acting out, and you're guided by your inner voice to act in a way that not only provides you with the make-believe story, but kind of generalizes over into more difficult cognitive processes like stuff in school and stuff. Okay, so cognitive milestones. In middle childhood, thinks in a more organized and logical fashion. Conservation, we've got it. Classification, seriation. They display more effective spatial reasoning, cognitive maps, they can follow directions, but it's still quite different than adolescence, which is more abstract reasoning, propositional thought, can reason about situations contradicting reality. Um, we will talk about in psychosocial development during adolescence is something called the imaginary audience and the personal fable. This is pretty interesting stuff. We'll talk about it when we get there. Improved decision-making strategies. So there's still a big gulf to jump over, a big chasm to jump over before they have adolescent thought. Okay. So information processing, we haven't talked about that much up until now, and I think it's because really this you can see it in middle childhood. So the theory of information processing is to break down cognitive thought in kids similar to like a computer. Okay, so computers take information in, computers process that information gets used, or that information might get saved for a very, very long time in the memory. Okay, well, that's sort of how information processing theorists look at cognition in people. So I know this is a crazy picture. This is a really, really famous model of cognition, well, memory by Atkinson and Shiffrin. Okay, and it goes like this. So something happens in your environment and you attend to it, right? It grabs your attention. Maybe it's a picture that flashed on the wall, okay? So it grabs your attention, you look at it, that information goes into something called the sensory registry, which really is just your visual system. So it goes into your visual system's memory, but that visual system's memory, it only lasts for like a millisecond, really, really short. If it wasn't important what you saw, it's going to go away and you may not even realize you saw it. But if it was important, then it's going to go into something called your working memory or your short-term memory. I would argue that working memory and short-term memory are actually two completely different things. It really depends on the psychologist or the neuroscientist that you talk to about it. Most of the neuroscientists that I worked with believed that short-term memory and working memory were two different things. Okay, so we're going to go from sensory into either working memory or short-term memory. Now, if it goes into short-term memory and we rehearse it, that is, we go over it and over it and over it, it will go into long-term memory. Long-term memory lasts forever. It lasts for your whole life. I'm sure everybody can remember some detail from their early childhood. It was a memory that, you didn't even really have to process it long. You just experienced it and it went into long-term memory. And probably it circumvented working memory and short-term memory altogether. So if you had a really emotional experience when you were really young, that highly volatile experience will actually circumvent working memory and short-term memory and go directly into long-term memory. So the most obvious being trauma, like if you were at 9/11 or something, you didn't have to rehearse that and make it go into long-term memory, right? It just went directly there. And I could discuss the physiology with you, but it's unnecessary. Needless to say, it goes directly into long-term memory. So trauma memories, or like a really fantastically good memory when you were little, can go directly into long-term memory, because these are emotional memories. So really emotional memories can sometimes circumvent those working memory and short-term memory components of memory and go right to long-term memory. The kind of stuff that goes into working memory or short-term memory would be like how to read, um, how to skateboard. Oh my God, I'm pulling a blank. There are so many things that we actively need to practice to get them into long-term memory. So when you study for a test, you rehearse and it goes into working memory or short-term memory. And hopefully you rehearse it long enough, it goes into long-term memory so you can get it right on the test. Now, another part of this model is the idea of retrieval. So once something gets into long-term memory, you have to be able to go into long-term memory, bring it back out, and use it. Okay. Some people actually have trouble with retrieval. Some people have trouble with rehearsal, so rehearsing a memory and getting it into long-term memory. Some people have trouble with short-term memory, so that the memories can't even get into long-term memory because their short-term memory is screwed up. Um, I want to describe what working memory is, though. Working memory is kind of tricky. So I want you to think about like a calculus problem. So say your teacher gives you a complicated calculus problem. Well, you have to go into long-term memory and get all the rules for algebra and bring them, retrieve them into your working memory. Then you have to use your short-term memory to be able to read the calculus problem and move and try to solve it. Read it, understand what's being asked of you, and then apply those algebraic principles to that calculus problem. That's what working memory is. It's the combination of retrieving long-term memory and the process of short-term memory to solve some problem. Okay, that's why it's different than short-term memory. So here's a slide that shows you advances in memory from infancy to age 11. Most importantly for us, in 7 to 9 years old, children use new strategies to remember things, like chunking. Okay, I don't know if you remember this from intro to psych, but chunking is like, say you have to remember a really long number, like 732459, okay? That's a lot of information. But maybe you chunk it together, so you make it like 732 and 439. It's easier to remember those two numbers than it is to remember all those single 7 numbers. That's called chunking, and that's definitely something that kids do. Another thing is rhymes. Okay, you make up a rhyme to try to remember something. And from the years 9 to 11, memory becomes more adaptive and strategic. So there are more tools that kids learn to memorize stuff, more memory techniques. Okay, working memory really improves from age 4 and up, all right, which is critical. So to be honest with you, the IQ test that I talked about in the other PowerPoint, the IQ test is, many cognitive psychologists believe that the IQ test is actually a test of working memory. Working memory is what you use in an academic setting. So when you're in school and you're solving problems and taking tests and all that stuff, it's your working memory. And some people argue that the better your working memory, the smarter that you are. There are some people that gauge into smartness by your working memory capacity. By the time we get to the end of middle childhood, long-term memory, like I said, is limitless. Little kids, like there's some people that believe that they can remember things when they were really, really little, like 2 years old. You can't. And I'll tell you why. Your brain's not developed enough to lay down the memory traces so that you have that memory. Things aren't myelinated. Your hippocampus, which is basically the seat of memory, is not fully developed. It doesn't become fully developed till around 8 years old, 7 years old. So the areas of the brain responsible for memory aren't all set up, and the neurons aren't all set up. So you just can't remember stuff from like infancy. But now at this stage, like I said, around 7 and 8, long-term memory becomes very powerful, and working memory. Okay, memory storage too expands over childhood. It gets really, really large. You're just able to put infinite amounts into memory. I think that probably diminishes as you age. Okay. Um, One of the last things that really starts to arise during this stage with respect to cognition is something called metacognition. And we all do it. We do it all the time. Basically, it's thinking about what we're thinking. So you're thinking about thinking. It's the ability to evaluate a cognitive task. So it's your ability to, maybe you write something like some kind of argumentative paper or research paper, and you're able to go back and reevaluate what you did, and to see if you've done the task to the best of your ability. It's also thinking about the way that you thought about something. Oh, it's so hard to explain. So let's say you have a problem and you, in your mind, it could even be a social problem or a problem with your friend or a problem with your partner or something. You have an argument and you think about your argument, and then you think about the points that you made and the argument you took, and then you reevaluate those and perhaps edit them. So it's thinking about thinking. um, it's an essential skill for learning. It includes thoughts about what we know or don't know and regulating how we go about learning. Um, it says here on the slide, metacognitive deficiencies are the problem of the novice, regardless of age. Um, so if you've never done anything before, then you're not able to go back and reevaluate the way you approached it, right? So whenever we try things for the first time, it's very difficult to think about how we're approaching something. But with an increase of knowledge base on that topic, we're able to go back and reevaluate our methods, right? So a knowledge base gives us or allows us to use metacognition and think about the way that we're thinking. But if you've never done anything before, then you have no idea how many strategies there are to apply. Okay, lastly, control processes again are beginning to increase in kids this age. So control processes, we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. We're talking not just about cognition, but also emotions. So selective attention, emotional regulation, impulse control, knowing that your actions have a consequence, planning, processing speed, all these things are control processes. Some people like to call the prefrontal cortex the CEO of your brain, just like a CEO of a company. It's the head of the company, it directs the company, it attends. So the area of the brain that controls executive functions. Um, Including weighing long-term consequences of controlling impulse, is among the last to fully mature. So actually, your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until 25. Okay, so anybody out there who's under 25, your PFC still has a ways to go. The myelination isn't fully developed, and some of the connections aren't fully developed. And when we talk about adolescence, we'll go over how problem solving for a lot of adolescents is completely split in half. You can they either approach problems from a very, very emotional standpoint, or they approach problems from a very mature, logical standpoint. It depends. And that makes for some very interesting conversations with adolescents, because you really get a mix. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get into adolescence. I hope that this was informative.